should about do it. Okay, I think we are all set. All right. Gonna get some fluid in me. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome back to Story Time Saturdays. I'm your host, narrator, rather, Fraggoth. And today we're going to continue readings from Greg Egan's Axiomatic. How nice. Last week, I know, we ended on a bit of a downer is probably the wrong word, but we're going to stick with downer for now as the term. With the cutie, where the guy has the artificial is the wrong word, but child of convenience, I guess, maybe is the right term. It doesn't quite nail it. In any case, child as commodity, infant as commodity, rather, in the form of the cutie, and then it turns out to be a defective product in that it is developing as just as intelligent as a normal child would, and it'll only live to age 4. That's not depressing at all, no siree, Bob, not even a little bit. So today we're going to do something that's a bit more of a thriller. And it's called Into Darkness. This one's pretty cool. I compare this one to The Infinite Assassin, the story from the very beginning. In that, it's sort of about a journey, a sort of quest, um, pushing into a different, pushing into a realm where the rules are different, as it were. Alrighty, let me just make sure I'm at the right page here. Come on. There we go. Alrighty. Take another drink of water here. And we shall begin. As always, feel free to leave some comments if you like what I'm doing. If you don't like what I'm doing, leave some comments anyway. I don't care. That's fine. Constructive criticism is always appreciated. If you tell me I'm a terrible person, that's fine as well. I guess. I guess that's fine. I'd rather you didn't, but eh. To each their own. Alrighty. Let us begin. Into Darkness by Greg Egan. The tone from the buzzer rises in both pitch and loudness the longer it's on, so I leap out of bed knowing that it's taken me less than a second to wake. I swear I was dreaming at first, though, dreaming the sound long before it was real. That's happened a few times. Maybe it's just a trick of the mind. Maybe some dreams take shape only in the act of remembering them. Or maybe I dream it every night, every sleeping moment, just in case. The light above the buzzer is red, not a rehearsal. I dress on my way across the room to thump the acknowledgement switch. As soon as the buzzer shuts off, I can hear the approaching siren. It takes me as long to lace my shoes as everything else combined. I grab my backpack from beside the bed and flick on the power. It starts flashing LEDs as it goes through its self-checking routines. By the time I'm at the curb, the patrol car is braking noisily, rear passenger door swinging open. I know the driver, Angelo, but I haven't seen the other cop before. As we accelerate, a satellite view of the intake in false color infrared, a pitch-black circle in a landscape of polychromatic blotches, appears on the car's terminal. A moment later, this is replaced by a street map of the region, one of the newer far northern suburbs, all cul-de-sacs and crescents, with the intake's perimeter and center marked, and a dashed line showing where the core should be. The optimal routes are omitted, too much clutter and the mind balks. I stare at the map, trying to commit it to memory. It's not that I won't have access to it inside, but it's always faster to just know. When I close my eyes to see how I'm going, the pattern in my head looks nothing so much as a puzzle book maze. We hit the freeway and Angelo lets loose. He's a good driver, but I sometimes wonder if this is the riskiest part of the whole business. The cop I don't know doesn't think so. He turns to me and says, "I gotta tell you one thing. I respect what you do, but you must be fucking crazy. I wouldn't go inside that thing for $1 million." Angelo grins. I catch it in the rearview mirror and says, "Hey, how much is the Nobel Prize anyway? More than $1 million?" I snort. I doubt it. And I don't think they give the Nobel Prize for the 800-meter steeplechase. The media seem to have decided to portray me as some kind of expert. I don't know why, unless it's because I once used the phrase radially anisotropic in an interview. It's true that I carried one of the first scientific payloads, but any other runner could have done that, and these days it's routine. The fact is, by international agreement, no one with even a microscopic chance of contributing to the theory of the intake is allowed to risk their life by going inside. If I'm atypical in any way, it's through a lack of relevant qualifications. Most of the other volunteers have a background in the conventional rescue services. I switch my watch into chronograph mode and sync it to the count that the terminal's now showing, then do the same to my backpack's timer. 6 minutes and 12 seconds. The intake's manifestations obey exactly the same statistics as a radioactive nucleus with a half-life of 18 minutes. 79% last 6 minutes or more, but multiply anything by 0.962 every minute, and you wouldn't believe how fast it can fall. I've memorized the probabilities right out to an hour, 10%, which may or may not have been a wise thing to do. Counter to intuition, the intake does not become more dangerous as time passes, any more than a single radioactive nucleus becomes more unstable. At any given moment, assuming that it hasn't yet vanished, it's just as likely as ever to stick around for another 18 minutes. A mere 10% of manifestations last for an hour or more, but of that 10%, half will still be there 18 minutes later. The danger has not increased. For a runner inside to ask what the odds are now, he or she must be alive to pose the question, and so the probability curve must start afresh from that moment. History can't harm you. The chance of having survived the last X minutes is 100% once you've done it. As the unknowable future becomes the unchangeable past, risk must collapse into certainty, one way or another. Whether or not any of us really think this way is another question. You can't help having a gut feeling that time is running out, that the odds are being whittled away. Everyone keeps track of the time since the intake materialized, however theoretically irrelevant that is. The truth is, these abstractions make no difference in the end. You do what you can, as fast as you can, regardless. It's 2 in the morning, the freeway is empty, but it still takes me by surprise when we screech onto the exit ramp so soon. My stomach is painfully tight. I wish I felt ready, but I never do. After 10 real calls, after nearly 200 rehearsals, I never do. I always wish I had more time to compose myself, although I have no idea what state of mind I'd aim for, let alone how I'd achieve it. Some lunatic part of me is always hoping for a delay. If what I'm really hoping is that the intake will have vanished before I can reach it, I shouldn't be here at all. The coordinators tell us over and over, "You can back out any time you want to. Nobody would think any less of you." It's true, of course, up to the point where backing out becomes physically impossible, but it's a freedom I could do without. Retiring would be one thing, but once I've accepted a call, I don't want to have to waste my energy on second thoughts. I don't want to have to endlessly reaffirm my choice. I've psyched myself into half believing that I couldn't live with myself, however understanding other people might be, and that helps a little. The only trouble is, this lie might be self-fulfilling, and I really don't want to become that kind of person. I close my eyes, and the map appears before me. I'm a mess, there's no denying it, but I can still do the job. I can still get results. That is what counts. I can tell when we're getting close, without even searching the skyline. There are lights on in all of the houses, and families standing in their front yards. Many people wave and cheer as we pass, a sight that always depresses me. When a group of teenagers, standing on a street corner drinking beer, scream abuse and gesture obscenely, I can't help feeling perversely encouraged. Dickheads, mutters the cop I don't know. I keep my mouth shut. We take a corner, and I spot a trio of helicopters high on my right, ascending with a huge projection screen in tow. Suddenly, a corner of the screen is obscured, and my eye extends to the curve of the eclipsing object from this one tiny arc to giddy completion. From outside, by day, the intake makes an impressive sight. A giant black dome, completely non-reflective, blotting out a great bite of the sky. It's impossible not to believe that you're confronting a massive, solid object. By night, though, it's different. The shape is still unmistakable, cut in a velvet black that makes the darkest night seem gray, but there's no illusion of solidity, just an awareness of a different kind of void. The intake has been appearing for almost 10 years now. It's always a perfect sphere, a little more than a kilometer in radius, and usually centered close to ground level. On rare occasions, it's been known to appear out at sea, and, slightly more often, on uninhabited land, but the vast majority of its incarnations take place in populated regions. The currently favored hypothesis is that a future civilization tried to construct a wormhole that would let them sample the distant past, bringing specimens of ancient life into their own time to be studied. They screwed up. Both ends of the wormhole came unstuck. The thing has shrunk and deformed from, presumably, some kind of grand temporal highway bridging geological epochs, to a gateway that now spans less time than it would take to cross an atomic nucleus at the speed of light. One end, the intake, is a kilometer in radius. The other is about a fifth as big, spatially concentric with the first, but displaced an almost immeasurably small time into the future. We call the inner sphere, the wormhole's destination, which seems to be inside it but isn't, the core. Why this shriveled up piece of failed temporal engineering has ended up in the present era is anyone's guess. Maybe we just happened to be halfway between the original endpoints, and the thing collapsed symmetrically. Pure bad luck. The trouble is, it hasn't quite come to rest. It materializes somewhere on the planet, remains fixed for several minutes, then loses its grip and vanishes, only to appear at a new location a fraction of a second later. 10 years of analyzing the data has yielded no method for predicting successive locations, but there must be some remnant of a navigation system in action. Why else would the wormhole cling to the Earth's surface, with a marked preference for inhabited dry land, instead of wandering off on a random course into interplanetary space? It's as if some faithful, demented computer keeps valiantly trying to anchor the intake to a region which might be of interest to its scholarly masters. No Paleozoic life can be found, but 21st century cities will do, since there's nothing much else around. And every time it fails to make a permanent connection and slips off into hyperspace, with infinite dedication and unbounded stupidity, it tries again. Being of interest is bad news. Inside the wormhole, time is mixed with one spatial dimension, and, whether by design or physical necessity, any movement which equates to traveling from the future into the past is forbidden. Translated into the wormhole's present geometry, this means that when the intake materializes around you, motion away from the center is impossible. You have an unknown time, maybe 18 minutes, maybe more, maybe less, to navigate your way to the safety of the core under these bizarre conditions. What's more, light is subject to the same effect. It only propagates inward. Everything closer to the center than you lies in the invisible future. You are running into darkness. I have heard people scoff at the notion that any of this could be difficult. I'm not quite enough of a sadist to hope that they learn the truth firsthand. Actually, outward motion isn't quite literally impossible. If it were, everyone caught in the intake would die at once. The heart has to circulate blood, the lungs have to inhale and exhale, nerve impulses have to travel in all directions. Every single living cell relies on shuffling chemicals back and forth, and I can't even guess what the effect would be on the molecular level, if electron clouds could fluctuate in one direction but not the reverse. There is some leeway. Because the wormhole's entire 800 meters spans such a minute time interval, the distance scale of the human body corresponds to an even shorter period, short enough for quantum effects to come into play. Quantum uncertainty in the space-time metric permits small, localized violations of the classical law's absolute restriction. So, instead of everyone dying on the spot, blood pressure goes up, the heart is stressed, breathing becomes laborious, and the brain may function erratically. Enzymes, hormones, and other biological molecules are all slightly deformed, causing them to bind less efficiently to their targets, interfering to some degree with every biochemical process. Hemoglobin, for example, loses its grip on oxygen more easily. Water diffuses out of the body, because random thermal motion is suddenly not so random, leading to gradual dehydration. People already in very poor health can die from these effects. Others are just made nauseous, weak, and confused, on top of the inevitable shock and panic. They make bad decisions. They get trapped. One way or another, a few hundred lives are lost every time the intake materializes. Intake runners may save 10 or 20 people, which I'll admit is not much of a success rate, but until some genius works out how to rid us of the wormhole for good, it's better than nothing. The screen is in place high above us when we reach the South Operations Center, a couple of vans stuffed with electronics, parked on someone's front lawn. The now familiar section of street map appears, the image rock steady and in perfect focus, in spite of the fact that it's being projected from a fourth helicopter, and all four are jittering in the powerful upward wind. People inside can see out, of course. This map, and the others at other compass points, will save dozens of lives. In theory, once outdoors, it should be simple enough to head straight for the core. After all, there's no easier direction to find, no easier path to follow. The trouble is, a straight line inward is likely to lead you into obstacles, and when you can't retrace your steps, the most mundane of these can kill you. So, the map is covered with arrows, marking the optimal routes to the core, given the constraint of staying safely on the roads. Two more helicopters, hovering above the intake, are doing one better. With high-velocity paint guns under computer control and laser ring inertial guidance systems constantly telling the shuttering computers their precise location and orientation, they're drawing the same arrows in fluorescent reflective paint on the invisible streets below. You can't see the arrows ahead of you, but you can look back at the ones you've passed. It helps. There's a small crowd of coordinators and one or two runners around vans. This scene always looks forlorn to me, like some small-time rained-out amateur athletics event, air traffic notwithstanding. Angelo calls out, "Break a leg!" as I run from the car. I raise a hand and wave without turning. Loudspeakers are blasting the standard advice inward, cycling through a dozen languages. In the corner of my eye, I can see a TV crew arriving. I glance at my watch. 9 minutes. I can't help thinking, 71%, although the intake is clearly 100% still there. Someone taps me on the shoulder. Elaine. She smiles and says, "John, see you in the core," and then sprints into the wall of darkness before I can reply. Dolores is handing out assignments on RAM. She wrote most of the software used by intake runners around the world, but then she makes her living writing computer games. She's even written a game which models the intake itself, but sales have been less than spectacular. The reviewers decided it was in bad taste. What's next? Let's play Airline Disaster? Maybe they think flight simulators should be programmed for endless calm weather. Meanwhile, televangelists sell prayers to keep the wormhole away. You just slip that credit card into the home shopping slot for instant protection. What have you got for me? 3 infants. Is that all? You come late, you get the crumbs. I plug the cartridge into my backpack. A sector of the street map appears on the display panel, marked with 3 bright red dots. I strap on the pack and then adjust the display on its movable arms so I can catch it with a sideways glance if I have to. Electronics can be made to function reliably inside the wormhole, but everything has to be specially designed. It's not 10 minutes, not quite. I grab a cup of water from a table beside one of the vans. A solution of mixed carbohydrates, supposedly optimized for our metabolic needs, is also on offer, but the one time I tried it, I was sorry. My gut isn't interested in absorbing anything at this stage, optimized or not. There's coffee, too, but the very last thing I need right now is a stimulant. Gulping down the water, I hear my name, and I can't help tuning in to the TV reporter's spiel. John Nately, high school science teacher and unlikely hero, embarking on this, his 11th call as a volunteer intake runner. If he survives tonight, he'll have set a new national record. But of course, the odds of making it through grow slimmer with every call, and by now... The moron is spouting crap. The odds do not grow slimmer. A veteran faces no extra risk. But this isn't the time to set him straight. I swing my arms for a few seconds in a half-hearted warm-up, but there's not much point. Every muscle in my body is tense, and will be for the next 800 meters, whatever I do. I try to blank my mind and just concentrate on the run-up. The faster you hit the intake, the less of a shock it is. And before I can ask myself, for the first time tonight, what the fuck I'm really doing here, I've left the isotropic universe behind, and the question is academic. The darkness doesn't swallow you. Perhaps that's the strangest part of it all. You've seen it swallow other runners, why doesn't it swallow you? Instead, it recedes from your every step. The borderline isn't absolute. Quantum fuzziness produces a gradual fade out, stretching visibility about as far as each extended foot. By day, this is completely surreal, and people have been known to suffer fits and psychotic episodes at the sight of the void's apparent retreat. By night, it seems merely implausible, like chasing an intelligent fog. At the start, it's almost too easy. Memories of pain and fatigue seem ludicrous. Thanks to frequent rehearsals in a compression harness, the pattern of resistance as I breathe is almost familiar. Runners once took drugs to lower their blood pressure, but with sufficient training, the body's own vasoregulatory system can be made flexible enough to cope with the stress unaided. The odd tugging sensation on each leg as I bring it forward would probably drive me mad if I didn't, crudely, understand the reason for it. Inward motion is resisted when pulling rather than pushing is involved because information travels outward. If I trailed a 10-meter rope behind me, I wouldn't be able to take a single step. Pulling on the rope would pass information about my motion from where I am to a point further out. That's forbidden. And it's only the quantum leeway that lets me drag each foot forward at all. The street curves gently to the right, gradually losing its radial orientation, but there's no convenient turn-off yet. I stay in the middle of the road, straddling the double white line as the border between past and future swings to the left. The road surface seems always to slope toward the darkness, but that's just another wormhole effect. The bias in the thermal molecular motion, cause of the inward wind and slow dehydration, produces a force or pseudo-force on solid objects too, tilting the apparent vertical. Me, please! A man's voice, desperate and bewildered, and almost indignant, as if he can't help believing that I must have heard him all along, that I must have been feigning deafness out of malice or indifference. I turn without slowing. I've learned to do it in a way that makes me only slightly dizzy. Everything appears almost normal, looking outward, apart from the fact that the streetlights are out, and so most illumination is from helicopter floodlights and the giant street map in the sky. The cry came from a bus shelter, all vandal-proof plastic and reinforced glass, at least 5 meters behind me now. It might as well be on Mars. Wire mesh covers the glass. I can just make out the figure behind it, a faint silhouette. Help me! Mercifully, for me, I've vanished into this man's darkness. I don't have to think of a gesture to make, an expression to put on my face, appropriate to the situation. I turn away and pick up speed. I'm not inured to the death of strangers, but I am inured to my helplessness. After 10 years of the intake, there are international standards for painted markings on the ground around every potential hazard in public open space. Like all the other measures, it helps, slightly. There are standards, too, for eventually eliminating the hazards, designing out the corners where people can be trapped, but that's going to cost billions and take decades, and won't even touch the real problem: interiors. I've seen demonstration trap-free houses and office blocks with doors or curtained doorways in every corner of every room, but the style hasn't exactly caught on. My own house is far from ideal. My own house is far from ideal. After getting quotes for alterations, I decided that the cheapest solution was to keep a sledgehammer beside every wall. I turn left, just in time to see a trail of glowing arrows hiss into place on the road behind me. I'm almost at my first assignment. I tap a button on my backpack and peer sideways at the display as it switches to a plan of the target house. As soon as the intake's position is known, Dolores' software starts hunting through databases, assembling a list of locations where there's a reasonable chance we can do some good. Our information is never complete, and sometimes just plain wrong. Census data is often out of date, building plans can be inaccurate, misfiled, or simply missing, but it beats walking blind into houses chosen at random. I slow almost to a walk, 2 houses before the target, to give myself time to grow used to the effects. Running inward lessens the outward components, relative to the wormhole, of the body's cyclic motions. Slowing down always feels like precisely the wrong thing to do. I often dream of running through a narrow canyon no wider than my shoulders, whose walls will stay apart only so long as I move fast enough. That's what my body thinks of slowing down. The street here lies about 30 degrees off radial. I cross the front lawn of the neighboring house, then step over a knee-high brick wall. At this angle, there are few surprises. Most of what's hidden is so easy to extrapolate that it almost seems visible in the mind's eye. A corner of the target house emerges from the darkness on my left. I get my bearings from it and head straight for a side window. Entry by the front door would cost me access to almost half the house, including the bedroom, which Dolores's highly erratic room use predictor nominates as the one most likely to be the child's. People can file room use information with us directly, but few bother. I smash the glass with a crowbar, open the window, and clamber through. I leave a small electric lamp on the windowsill. Carrying it with me would render it useless, and move slowly into the room. I'm already starting to feel dizzy and nauseous, but I force myself to concentrate. One step too many, and the rescue becomes 10 times more difficult. 2 steps, and it's impossible. It's clear that I have the right room when a dresser is revealed, piled with plastic toys, talcum powder, baby shampoo, and other paraphernalia spilling onto the floor. Then a corner of the crib appears on my left, pointed at an unexpected angle. The thing was probably neatly parallel with the wall to start with, but slid unevenly under the inward force. I sidle up to it, then inch forward until a lump beneath the blanket comes into view. I hate this moment, but the longer I wait, the harder it gets. I reach sideways and lift the child, bringing the blanket with it. I kick the crib aside, then walk forward, slowly bending my arms, until I can slip the child into the harness on my chest. An adult is strong enough to drag a small baby a short distance outward. It's usually fatal. The kid hasn't stirred. He or she is unconscious, but breathing. I shudder briefly, a kind of shorthand emotional catharsis. Then I start moving. I glance at the display to recheck the way out, and finally let myself notice the time. 13 minutes. 61%. More to the point, the core is just 2 or 3 minutes away, downhill, non-stop. One successful assignment means ditching the rest. There's no alternative. You can't lug a child with you in and out of buildings. You can't even put it down somewhere and come back for it later. As I step through the front door, the sense of relief leaves me giddy. Either that or a renewed cerebral blood flow. I pick up speed as I cross the lawn and catch a glimpse of a woman shouting, "Wait! Stop!" I slow down. She catches up with me. I put a hand on her shoulder and propel her slightly ahead of me, then say, "Keep moving as fast as you can. When you want to speak, fall behind me. I'll do the same, okay?" I move ahead of her. She says, "That's my daughter you've got. Is she all right? Oh, please, is she alive?" "She's fine. Stay calm. We just have to get her to the core now. Okay?" "I want to hold her. I want to take her." "Wait until we're safe." "I want to take her there myself." Shit. I glance at her sideways. Her face is glistening with sweat and tears. One of her arms is bruised and blotchy, the usual symptom of trying to reach out to something unreachable. "I really think it would be better to wait." "What right have you got? She's my daughter. Give her to me." The woman is indignant, but remarkably lucid, considering what she's been through. I can't imagine what it must have felt like to stand by that house, hoping insanely for some kind of miracle, while everyone in the neighborhood fled past her, and the side effects made her sicker and sicker. However pointless, however idiotic her courage, I can't help admiring it. I'm lucky. My ex-wife and our son and daughter live halfway across town from me. I have no friends who live nearby. My emotional geography is very carefully arranged. I don't give a shit about anyone who I could end up unable to save. So what do I do? Sprint away from her, leave her running after me, screaming? Maybe I should. If I gave her the child, though, I could check out one more house. Do you know how to handle her? Never try to move her backward, away from the darkness. Never. I know that. I've read all the articles. I know what you're meant to do. Okay. I must be crazy. We slow down to a walk, and I pass the child to her, lowering it into her arms from beside her. I realize almost too late that we're at the turnoff for the second house. As the woman vanishes into the darkness, I yell after her, "Run! Follow the arrows and run!" I check the time. 15 minutes already, with all that stuffing around. I'm still alive, though, so the odds now are, as always, 50-50 that the wormhole will last another 18 minutes. Of course, I could die at any second, but that was equally true when I first stepped inside. I'm no greater fool now than I was then, for what that's worth. The second house is empty, and it's easy to see why. The computer's guess for the nursery is in fact a study, and the parent's bedroom is outward of the child's. Windows are open, clearly showing the path that they must have taken. A strange mood overtakes me as I leave the house behind. The inward wind seems stronger than ever. The road turns straight into the darkness, and I feel an inexplicable tranquility wash over me. I'm moving as fast as I can, but the edge of latent panic, of sudden death, is gone. My lungs, my muscles are battling all the same restraints, but I feel curiously detached from them, aware of the pain and effort, yet somehow uninvolved. The truth is, I know exactly why I'm here. I can never quite admit it outside. It seems too whimsical, too bizarre. Of course, I'm glad to save lives, and maybe that's grown to be a part of it. No doubt I also crave to be thought of as a hero. The real reason, though, is too strange to be judged as either selfless or vain. The wormhole makes tangible the most basic truths of existence. You cannot see the future. You cannot change the past. All of life consists of running into darkness. This is why I'm here. My body grows not numb, but separate, a puppet dancing and twitching on a treadmill. I snap out of this and check the map, not a moment too soon. I have to turn right, sharply, which puts an end to any risk of somnambulism. Looking up at the bisected world makes my head pound, so I stare at my feet and try to recall if the pooling of blood in my left hemisphere ought to make me more rational or less. The third house is in a borderline situation. The parent's bedroom is slightly outward from the child's, but the doorway gives access to only half the room. I enter through a window that the parents could not have used. The child is dead. I see the blood before anything else. I feel suddenly very tired. A slit of the doorway is visible, and I know what must have happened. The mother or father edged their way in and found they could just reach the child, could take hold of one hand, but no more. Pulling inward is resisted, but people find that confusing. They don't expect it. And when it happens, they fight it. When you want to snatch someone you love out of the jaws of danger, you pull with all your strength. The door is an easy exit for me, but less so for anyone who came in that way, especially someone in the throes of grief. I stare into the darkness of the room's inward corner and yell, "Crouch down, as low as you can!" then mime doing so. I pluck the demolition gun from my backpack and aim high. The recoil, in normal space, would send me sprawling. Here, it's a mere thump. I step forward, giving up my own chance to use the door. There's no immediate sign that I've just blasted a meter-wide hole in the wall. Virtually all of the dust and debris is on the inward side. I finally reach a man kneeling in the corner, his hands on his head. For a brief moment I think he's alive, that he took this position to shield himself from the blast. No pulse, no respiration. A dozen broken ribs, probably. I'm not inclined to check. Some people can last for an hour, pinned between walls of brick and an invisible third wall that follows them ruthlessly into the corner every time they slip, every time they give ground. Some people, though, do exactly the worst thing. They squeeze themselves into the inwardmost part of their prison, obeying some instinct which, I'm sure, makes sense at the time. Or maybe he wasn't confused at all. Maybe he just wanted it to be over. I hoist myself through the hole in the wall. I stagger through the kitchen. The fucking plan is wrong, wrong, wrong. A door I'm expecting doesn't exist. I smash the kitchen window, then cut my hand on the way out. I refuse to glance at the map. I don't want to know the time. Now that I'm alone, with no purpose left but saving myself, everything is jinxed. I stare at the ground and at the fleeting magic golden arrows, trying not to count them. One glimpse of a festering hamburger discarded on the road, and I find myself throwing up. Common sense tells me to turn and face backward, but I'm not quite that stupid. The acid in my throat and nose brings tears to my eyes. As I shake them away, something impossible happens. A brilliant blue light appears, high up in the darkness ahead, dazzling my dark adapted eyes. I shield my face, then peer between my fingers. As I grow used to the glare, I start to make out details. A cluster of long, thin, luminous cylinders is hanging in the sky, like some mad upside-down pipe organ built of glass, bathed in glowing plasma. The light it casts does nothing to reveal the houses and streets below. I must be hallucinating. I've seen shapes in the darkness before, although never anything so spectacular, so persistent. I run faster in the hope of clearing my head. The apparition doesn't vanish or waver. It merely grows closer. I halt, shaking uncontrollably. I stare into the impossible light. What if it's not in my head? There's only one possible explanation. Some component of the wormhole's hidden machinery has revealed itself. The idiot navigator is showing me its worthless soul. With one voice in my skull screaming, "No!" and another calmly asserting that I have no choice, that this chance might never come again, I draw the demolition gun, take aim, and fire. As if some puny weapon in the hands of an amoeba could scratch the shimmering artifact of a civilization whose failures leave us cowering in awe. The structure shatters and implodes in silence. The light contracts to a blinding pinprick, burning itself into my vision. Only when I turn my head am I certain that the real light is gone. I start running again, terrified, elated. I have no idea what I've done, but the wormhole is, so far, unchanged. The afterimage lingers in the darkness, with nothing to wipe it away from my sight. Can hallucinations leave an afterimage? Did the navigator choose to expose itself, choose to let me destroy it? I trip on something and stagger, but catch myself from falling. I turn and see a man crawling down the road, and I bring myself to a rapid halt, astonished by such a mundane sight after my transcendental encounter. The man's legs have been amputated at the thighs. He's dragging himself along with his arms alone. That would be hard enough in normal space, but here the effort must almost be killing him. There are special wheelchairs which can function in the wormhole, wheels bigger than a certain size buckle and deform if the chair stalls, and if we know we'll need one, we bring one in, but they're too heavy for every runner to carry one just in case. The man lifts his head and yells, "Keep going, stupid fucker!" without the least sign of doubt that he's not just shouting at empty space. I stare at him and wonder why I don't take the advice. He's huge, big-boned and heavily muscled, with plenty of fat on top of that. I doubt that I could lift him, and I'm certain that if I could, I'd stagger along more slowly than he's crawling. Inspiration strikes. I'm in luck, too. A sideways glance reveals a house with a front door invisible but clearly only a meter or two inward of where I am now. I smash the hinges with a hammer and chisel, then maneuver the door out of the frame and back to the road. The man has already caught up with me. I bend down and tap him on the shoulder. "Want to try sledding?" I step inward in time to hear part of a string of obscenities, and to catch an unwelcome close-up of his bloody forearms. I throw the door down onto the road ahead of him. He keeps moving. I wait until he can hear me again. "Yes or no?" "Yes," he mutters. It's awkward, but it works. He sits on the door, leaning back on his arms. I run behind, bent over, my hands on his shoulders, pushing. Pushing is the one action the wormhole doesn't fight, and the inward force makes it downhill all the way. Sometimes the door slides so fast that I have to let go for a second or two to keep from overbalancing. I don't need to look at the map. I know the map. I know precisely where we are. The core is less than 100 meters away. In my head, I recite an incantation. An incantation. The danger does not increase. The danger does not increase. And in my heart, I know the whole conceit of probability is meaningless. The wormhole is reading my mind, waiting for the first sign of hope. And whether that comes 50 meters or 10 meters or 2 meters from safety, that is when it will take me. Some part of me calmly judges the distance we cover and counts 93, 92, 91. I mumble random thoughts to myself, and when that fails, I reset the count arbitrarily. 81, 87, 86, 85, 89. A new universe of light, stale air, noise, and people, countless people, explodes into being around me. I keep pushing the man on the door until someone runs toward me and gently prizes me away. Elaine. She guides me over to the front steps of a house while another runner with a first aid kit approaches my bloodied passenger. Groups of people stand or sit around electric lanterns, filling the streets and front yards as far as I can see. I point them out to Elaine. Look, aren't they beautiful? John, you okay? Get your breath. It's over. Oh, fuck. I glance at my watch. 21 minutes. 45%. I laugh hysterically. I was afraid of 45%? My heart is working twice as hard as it needs to. I pace for a while until the dizziness begins to subside. Then I flop down on the steps beside Elaine. A while later, I ask, Any others still out there? No? Great. I'm starting to feel almost lucid. So, how did you go? She shrugs. Okay, a sweet little girl. She's with her parents somewhere around here. No complications, favorable geometry. She shrugs again. Elaine is like that. Favorable geometry or not, it's never a big deal. I recount my own experience, leaving out the apparition. I should talk to the medical people first, straighten out what kind of hallucination is or isn't possible, before I start spreading the word that I took a pot shot at the glowing blue pipe organ from the future. Anyway, if I did any good, I'll know soon enough. If the intake does start drifting away from the planet, that shouldn't take long to make news. I have no idea at what rate the parting would take place, but surely the very next manifestation would be highly unlikely to be on the Earth's surface. Deep in the crust or halfway into space, I shake my head. There's no use building up my hopes prematurely when I'm still not sure that any of it was real. Elaine says, "What?" "Nothing." I check the time again. 29 minutes. 33%. I glance down the street impatiently. We can see out into the wormhole, of course, but the border is clearly delineated by the sudden drop in illumination. Once outward-bound light can no longer penetrate. When the intake moves on, though, it won't be a matter of looking for subtle shifts in the lighting. While the wormhole is in place, its effects violate the second law of thermodynamics. Biased thermal motion, for a start, clearly decreases entropy. In parting, it more than makes amends. It radically homogenizes the space it occupied, down to a length scale of about a micron. To the rock 200 meters beneath us and the atmosphere above, both already highly uniform, this will make little difference. But every house, every garden, every blade of grass, every structure visible to the naked eye will vanish. Nothing will remain but radial streaks of fine dust, swirling out as the high-pressure air in the core is finally free to escape. 35 minutes. 26%. I look around at the weary survivors. Even for those who left no family or friends behind, the sense of relief and thankfulness at having reached safety has no doubt faded. We, just want the waiting to be over. Everything about the passage of time, everything about the wormhole's uncertain duration, has reversed its significance. Yes, the thing might set us free at any moment, but so long as it hasn't, we're as likely as not to be stuck here for 18 more minutes. 40 minutes, 21%. Ears are really gonna pop tonight, I say. Or worse, on rare occasions, the pressure in the core can grow so high that the subsequent decompression gives rise to the bends. That's at least another hour away, though, and if it started to become a real possibility, they'd do an airdrop of a drug that would cushion us from the effect. 50 minutes, 15%. Everyone is silent now. Even the children have stopped crying. What's your record? I ask Elaine. She rolls her eyes. 56 minutes. You were there 4 years ago. Yeah, I remember. Just relax. Be patient. Don't you feel a little silly? I mean, if I'd known, I would have taken my time. 1 hour. 10%. Elaine has dozed off, her head against my shoulder. I'm starting to feel drowsy myself, but a nagging thought keeps me awake. I've always assumed that the wormhole moves because its efforts to stay put eventually fail. But what if the truth is precisely the opposite? What if it moves because its efforts to move have always eventually succeeded? What if the navigator breaks away to try again as quickly as it can, but its crippled machinery can do no better than a 50-50 chance of success for every 18 minutes of striving? Maybe I've put an end to that striving. Maybe I've brought the intake finally to rest. Eventually, the pressure itself can grow high enough to be fatal. It takes almost 5 hours. It's a 1 in 100,000 case, but it has happened once already. There's no reason at all it couldn't happen again. That's what bothers me most. I'd never know. Even if I saw people dying around me, the moment would never arrive when I knew for certain that this was the final price. Elaine stirs without opening her eyes. Still? Yeah. I put an arm around her. She doesn't seem to mind. Well, don't forget to wake me when it's over. And that was Into Darkness by Greg Egan. Awesome. Awesome. I like that one a lot. I think that one's a lot of fun. So some possibly time-traveling gizmo or doodad has either broken or is working perfectly. Who knows? Who knows with these future types? And when it manifests, you can only move inward towards the center point of its manifestation, which is a big black domey thing. Very, very cool. At least in my not at all humble opinion. Okay, what's the next one here? What is the next one here? Appropriate Love is the next one here. This one's kind of depressing too. Kind of like the cutie, but not quite as morbid, I guess, but still depressing. Let's see. You'll find that that's kind of a recurring theme. Actually, if I can get through that one and the one after it, although my time is sort of iffy, I could just do a marathon one next week. A really, really long one. Because we're just about at the end here. Just about at the end. Got another, like, 3 more stories, I think. 4, including Appropriate Love. Appropriate Love, Moral Virologist. Closer. Is there one after Closer before the end story? Yeah, yeah, 4 more stories in Axiomatic, including Appropriate Love. So yeah, I could just do a marathon one next week. Because the Moral Virologist is a little longish, not super long, but longish. It's about as long as the one I just read, so and I only have about another hour before I have stuff I gotta do. Mm. Alrighty, and without further ado, crunch, crunch. Oh, oh, 1 sec. Tea is taking a while to kick in, so I'm yawning like a madman half the time. Alrighty. Appropriate Love by Greg Egan. Your husband is going to survive. There's no question about it. I closed my eyes for a moment and almost screamed with relief. At some point during the last 39 sleepless hours, the uncertainty had become far worse than the fear, and I'd almost succeeded in convincing myself that when the surgeons had said it was touch and go, they'd meant there was no hope at all. However, he is going to need a new body. I don't expect you want to hear another detailed account of his injuries, but there are too many organs damaged, too severely, for individual transplants or repairs to be a viable solution. I nodded. I was beginning to like this Mr. Allenby, despite the resentment I'd felt when he'd introduced himself. At least he looked me squarely in the eye and made clear, direct statements. Everyone else who'd spoken to me since I'd stepped inside the hospital had hedged their bets. One specialist had handed me a trauma analysis expert systems printout with 132 prognostic scenarios and their respective probabilities. A new body. That didn't frighten me at all. It sounded so clean, so simple. Individual transplants would have meant cutting Chris open, again and again, each time risking complications, each time subjecting him to a form of assault, however beneficial the intent. For the first few hours, a part of me had clung to the absurd hope that the whole thing had been a mistake, that Chris had walked away from the train wreck unscratched, that it was someone else in the operating theater, some thief who had stolen his wallet. After forcing myself to abandon this ludicrous fantasy and accept the truth that he had been injured, mutilated almost to the point of death, the prospect of a new body, pristine and whole, seemed an almost equally miraculous reprieve. Allenby went on. Your policy covers that side of things completely. The technicians, the surrogate, the handlers. I nodded again, hoping that he wouldn't insist on going into all the details. I knew all the details. They'd grow a clone of Chris, intervening in utero to prevent its brain from developing the capacity to do anything more than sustain life. Once born, the clone would be forced to a premature but healthy maturity by means of a sequence of elaborate biochemical lies, simulating the effects of normal aging and exercise at a subcellular level. Yes, I still had misgivings about hiring a woman's body, about creating a brain-damaged child, but we'd agonized about these issues when we'd decided to include the expensive technique in our insurance policies. Now was not the time to have second thoughts. The new body won't be ready for almost 2 years. In the meantime, the crucial thing, obviously, is to keep your husband's brain alive. Now, there's no prospect of him regaining consciousness in his present situation, so there's no compelling reason to try to maintain his other organs. That jolted me at first, but then I thought, why not? Why not cut Chris free from the wreck of his body, the way he'd been cut free from the wreck of the train? I'd seen the aftermath of the crash replayed on the waiting room TV. Rescue workers slicing away at the metal with their clean blue lasers, surgical and precise. Why not complete the act of liberation? He was his brain, not his crushed limbs, his shattered bones, his bruised and bleeding organs. What better way could there be for him to await the restoration of health than in a perfect, dreamless sleep with no risk of pain, unencumbered by the remnants of a body that would ultimately be discarded? I should remind you that your policy specifies that the least costly medically sanctioned option will be used for life support while the new body is being grown. I almost started to contradict him, but then I remembered. It was the only way that we'd been able to shoehorn the premium into our budget. The base rate for body replacements was so high that we'd had to compromise on the frills. At the time, Chris had joked, "I just hope they don't get cryonic storage working in our lifetimes. I don't much fancy you grinning up at me from the freezer every day for 2 years." You're saying that you want me to keep nothing but his brain alive because that's the cheapest method? Allenby frowned sympathetically. "I know it's unpleasant having to think about costs at a time like this, but I stress that the clause refers to medically sanctioned procedures. We certainly wouldn't insist that you do anything unsafe." I nearly said angrily, "You won't insist that I do anything." I didn't, though. I didn't have the energy to make a scene, and it would have been a hollow boast. In theory, the decision would be mine alone. In practice, Global Assurance were paying the bills. They couldn't dictate treatment directly, but if I couldn't raise the money to bridge the gap, I knew I had no choice but to go along with whatever arrangements they were willing to fund. I said, you'll have to give me some time to talk to the doctors to think things over." "Yes, of course. Absolutely. I should explain, though, that all of the various options—" I put a hand up to silence him. "Please, do we have to go into this right now? I told you I need to talk to the doctors. I need to get some sleep. I know, eventually I'm going to have to come to terms with all the details. The different life support companies, the different services they offer, the different kinds of machines, whatever. But it can wait for 12 hours, can't it? Please?" It wasn't just that I was desperately tired, probably still in shock, and beginning to suspect that I was being railroaded into some off-the-shelf package solution that Allenby had already costed down to the last cent. There was a woman in a white coat standing nearby, glancing our way surreptitiously every few seconds, as if waiting for the conversation to end. I hadn't seen her before, but that didn't prove that she wasn't part of the team looking after Chris. They'd sent me 6 different doctors already. If she had news, I wanted to hear it. Allenby said, "I'm sorry, but if you could just bear with me for a few more minutes, I really do need to explain something." His tone was apologetic, but tenacious. I didn't feel tenacious at all. I felt like I'd been struck all over with a rubber mallet. I didn't trust myself to keep arguing without losing control. And anyway, it seemed like letting him say his piece would be the fastest way to get rid of him. If he snowed me under with details that I wasn't ready to take in, then I'd just switch off and make him repeat it all later. I said, "Go on." "Of all the various options, the least costly doesn't involve a life support machine at all. There's a technique called biological life support that's recently been perfected in Europe. Over a 2-year period, it's more economical than other methods by a factor of about 20. What's more, the risk profile is extremely favorable." Biological life support? I've never even heard of it. "Well, yes, it is quite new, but I assure you it's down to a fine art." Yes, but what is it? What does it actually entail?
The brain is kept alive by sharing a second party's blood supply."
I stared at him. What? You mean create some two-headed... After so long without sleep, my sense of reality was already thinly stretched. For a moment, I literally believed that I was dreaming, that I'd fallen asleep on the waiting room couch and dreamed of good news, and now my wish-fulfilling fantasy was decaying into a mocking black farce to punish me for my ludicrous optimism. But Allenby didn't whip out a glossy brochure showing satisfied customers beaming cheek to cheek with their hosts.
He said, "No, no, no. Of course not. The brain is removed from the skull completely and encased in protective membranes into a fluid-filled sac. And it's sited internally."
Internally? Where internally? He hesitated and stole a glance at the white-coated woman, who was still hovering impatiently nearby. She seemed to take this as some kind of signal and began to approach us. Allenby, I realized, hadn't meant her to do so, and for a moment he was flustered, but he soon regained his composure and made the best of the intrusion. He said, "Miss Perini, this is Dr. Gale Sumner. Without a doubt, one of this hospital's brightest young gynecologists." Dr. Sumner flashed him a gleaming "that will be all, thanks" smile, then put one hand on my shoulder and started to steer me away. I went, electronically, to every bank on the planet, but they all seemed to feed my financial parameters into the same equations, and even at the most punitive interest rates, no one was willing to loan me a tenth of the amount I needed to make up the difference. Biological life support was just so much cheaper than traditional methods. My younger sister, Deborah, said, "Why not have a total hysterectomy? Slash and burn, yeah, that'd teach the bastards to try colonizing your womb." Everyone around me was going mad. And then what? Chris ends up dead and I end up mutilated. That's not my idea of victory. You would have made a point. I don't want to make a point. But you don't want to be forced to carry him, do you? Listen, if you hired the right PR people on a contingency basis and made the right kinds of gestures, you could get 70-80% of the public behind you. Organize a boycott. Give this insurance company enough bad publicity and enough financial pain, and they'll end up paying for whatever you want. No. You can't just think of yourself, Carla. You have to think of all the other women who will be treated the same way if you don't put up a fight. Maybe she was right, but I knew I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't turn myself into a cause célèbre and battle it out in the media. I just didn't have that kind of strength, that kind of stamina. And I thought, why should I have to? Why should I have to mount some kind of national PR campaign just to get a simple contract honored fairly? I sought legal advice.
Of course, they can't force you to do it. There are laws against slavery.
Yes, but in practice, what's the alternative? What else can I actually do?
Let your husband die. Have them switch off the life support machine he's on at present. That's not illegal. The hospital can and will do just that, with or without your consent, the moment they're no longer being paid.
I'd already been told this half a dozen times, but I still couldn't quite believe it. How can it be legal to murder him? It's not even euthanasia. He has every chance of recovering, every chance of leading a perfectly normal life. The solicitor shook her head. The technology exists to give just about anyone, however sick, however old, however badly injured, a perfectly normal life. But it all costs money. Resources are limited. Even if doctors and medical technicians were compelled to provide their services free of charge to whoever demanded them, and like I said, there are laws against slavery, well, someone somehow would have to miss out. The present government sees the market as the best way of determining who that is. Well, I have no intention of letting him die. All I want to do is keep him on a life support machine for 2 years. You may want it, but I'm afraid you simply can't afford it. Have you thought of hiring someone else to carry him? You're using a surrogate for his new body. Why not use one for his brain? It would be expensive, but not as expensive as a mechanical means. You might be able to scrape up the difference. There shouldn't be any fucking difference. Surrogates get paid a fortune. What gives Global Assurance the right to use my body for free? Ah, there's a clause in your policy. She tapped a few keys on her workstation and read from the screen. While in no way devaluing the contribution of the co-signatory as carer, he or she hereby expressly waives all entitlement to remuneration for any such services rendered. Furthermore, in all calculations pursuant to paragraph 97B, I thought that meant that neither of us could expect to get paid for nursing duties if the other spent a day in bed with the flu. I'm afraid the scope is much broader than that. I repeat, they do not have the right to compel you to do anything.
But nor do they have any obligation to pay for a surrogate. When they compute the costs for the cheapest way of keeping your husband alive, this provision entitles them to do so on the basis that you could choose to provide him with life support.
So ultimately, it's all a matter of accounting?
Exactly.
For a moment, I could think of nothing more to say. I knew I was being screwed, but I seemed to have run out of ways to articulate the fact. Then it finally occurred to me to ask the most obvious question of all. Suppose it had been the other way around. Suppose I'd been on that train instead of Chris. Would they have paid for a surrogate then? Or would they have expected him to carry my brain inside him for 2 years? The solicitor said, poker-faced, I really wouldn't like to hazard a guess on that one. Chris was bandaged in places, but most of his body was covered by a myriad of small machines, clinging to his skin like beneficial parasites. Feeding him, oxygenating and purifying his blood, dispensing drugs, perhaps even carrying out repairs on broken bones and damaged tissue, if only for the sake of staving off further deterioration. I could see part of his face, including one eye socket, sewn shut, and patches of bruised skin here and there. His right hand was entirely bare, they'd taken off his wedding ring. Both legs had been amputated just below the thighs. I couldn't get too close. He was enclosed in a sterile plastic tent, about 5 meters square, a kind of room within a room. A three-clawed nurse stood in one corner, motionless but vigilant, although I couldn't imagine the circumstances where its intervention would have been of more use than that of the smaller robots already in place. Visiting him was absurd, of course. He was deep in a coma, not even dreaming. I could give him no comfort. I sat there for hours, though, as if I needed to be constantly reminded that his body was injured beyond repair, that he really did need my help, or he would not survive. Sometimes my hesitancy struck me as so abhorrent that I couldn't believe that I'd not yet signed the forms and begun the preparatory treatment. His life was at stake. How could I think twice? How could I be that selfish? And yet, this guilt itself made me almost as angry and resentful as everything else. The coercion that wasn't quite coercion, the sexual politics that I couldn't quite bring myself to confront. To refuse to let him die was unthinkable. And yet, would I have carried the brain of a total stranger? No. Letting a stranger die wasn't unthinkable at all. Would I have done it for a casual acquaintance? No. A close friend? For some, perhaps, but not for others. So, just how much did I love him? Enough? Of course. Why, of course? It was a matter of loyalty? That wasn't the word. It smacked too much of some kind of unwritten contractual obligation, some notion of duty as pernicious and idiotic as patriotism. Well, duty could go fuck itself. That wasn't it at all. Why then? Why was he special? What made him different than the closest friend? I had no answer, no right words, just a rush of emotion-charged images of Chris. So I told myself, now is not the time to analyze it, to dissect it. I don't need an answer. I know what I feel. I lurched between despising myself for entertaining, however theoretically, the possibility of letting him die, and despising the fact that I was being bullied into doing something with my body that I did not want to do. The solution, of course, would have been to do neither. But what did I expect? Some rich benefactor to step out from behind a curtain and make the dilemma vanish? I'd seen a documentary, a week before the crash, showing some of the hundreds of thousands of men and women in Central Africa who spent their whole lives nursing dying relatives simply because they couldn't afford the AIDS drugs that had virtually wiped out the disease in wealthier countries 10, 20 years before. If they could have saved the lives of their loved ones by the minuscule sacrifice of carrying an extra kilogram and a half for 2 years. In the end, I gave up trying. I gave up trying to reconcile all the contradictions. I had a right to feel angry and cheated and resentful, but the fact remained that I wanted Chris to live. If I wasn't going to be manipulated, it had to work both ways. Reacting blindly against the way I'd been treated would have been no less stupid and dishonest than the most supine cooperation. It occurred to me, belatedly, that global assurance might not have been entirely artless in the way that they'd antagonized me. After all, if I let Chris die, they'd be spared not just the meager cost of biological life support, with the womb thrown in rent-free, but the whole expensive business of the replacement body as well. A little calculated crassness, a little reverse psychology. The only way to keep my sanity was to transcend all this bullshit, to declare global assurance and their machinations irrelevant, to carry his brain, not because I'd been coerced, not because I felt guilty or obliged, not to prove that I couldn't be manipulated, but for the simple reason that I loved him enough to want to save his life. They injected me with a gene-tailored blastocyst, a cluster of cells which implanted in the uterine wall and fooled my body into thinking that I was pregnant. Fooled? My periods ceased. I suffered morning sickness, anemia, immune suppression, hunger pangs. The pseudo-embryo grew at a literally dizzying rate, much faster than any child, rapidly forming the protective membranes and amniotic sac, and creating a placental blood supply that would eventually have the capacity to sustain an oxygen-hungry brain. I'd planned to work on as if nothing special was happening, but I soon discovered that I couldn't. I was just too sick and too exhausted to function normally. In 5 weeks, the thing inside me would grow to the size that a fetus would have taken 5 months to reach. I swallowed a fistful of dietary supplement capsules with every meal, but I was still too lethargic to do much more than sit around the flat, making desultory attempts to stave off boredom with books and junk TV. I vomited once or twice a day, urinated 3 or 4 times a night, all of which was bad enough, but I'm sure felt far more miserable than these symptoms alone could have made me. Perhaps half the problem was the lack of any simple way of thinking about what was happening to me. Apart from the actual structure of the embryo, I was pregnant, in every biochemical and physiological sense of the word, but I could hardly let myself go along with the deception. Even half pretending that the mass of amorphous tissue in my womb was a child would have been setting myself up for a complete emotional meltdown. But what was it then? A tumor? That was closer to the truth, but it wasn't exactly the kind of substitute image I needed. Of course, intellectually, I knew precisely what was inside me, and precisely what would become of it. I was not pregnant with a child who was destined to be ripped out of my womb to make way for my husband's brain. I did not have a vampiric tumor that would keep on growing until it drained so much blood from me that I'd be too weak to move. I was carrying a benign growth, a tool designed for a specific task, a task that I'd decided to accept. So why did I feel perpetually confused and depressed, and at times so desperate that I fantasized about suicide and miscarriage, about slashing myself open or throwing myself down the stairs? I was tired, I was nauseous, I didn't expect to be dancing for joy, but why was I so fucking unhappy that I couldn't stop thinking of death? I could have recited some kind of explanatory mantra. I'm doing this for Chris. I'm doing this for Chris. I didn't, though. I already resented him enough. I didn't want to end up hating him. Early in the 6th week, an ultrasound scan showed that the amniotic sac had reached the necessary size, and Doppler analysis of the blood flow confirmed that it too was on target. I went to the hospital for the substitution. I could have paid Chris one final visit, but I stayed away. I didn't want to dwell upon the mechanics of what lay ahead. Dr. Sumner said, "There's nothing to worry about. Fetal surgery far more complex than this is routine." I said through gritted teeth, "This isn't fetal surgery." She said, "Well, no," as if the news were a revelation. When I woke after the operation, I felt sicker than ever. I rested one hand on my belly. The wound was clean and numb, the stitches hidden. I'd been told that there wouldn't even be a scar. I thought, "He's inside me. They can't hurt him now. I've won that much." I closed my eyes. I had no trouble imagining Chris the way he'd been, the way he would be again. I drifted halfway back to sleep, shamelessly dredging up images of all the happiest times we'd had. I'd never indulged in sentimental reveries before. It wasn't my style. I hated living in the past. But any trick that sustained me was welcome now. I let myself hear his voice, see his face, feel his touch. His body, of course, was dead now. Irreversibly dead. I opened my eyes and looked down at the bulge in my abdomen, and pictured what it contained. A lump of meat from his corpse. A lump of gray meat torn from the skull of his corpse. I'd fasted for surgery. My stomach was empty. I had nothing to throw up. I lay there for hours, wiping sweat off my face with a corner of the sheet, trying to stop shaking. In terms of bulk, I was 5 months pregnant. In terms of weight, 7 months. For 2 years. If Kafka had been a woman. I didn't grow used to it, but I did learn to cope. There were ways to sleep, ways to sit, ways to move that were easier than others. I was tired all day long, but there were times when I had enough energy to feel almost normal again, and I made good use of them. I worked hard, and I didn't fall behind. The department was launching a new blitz on corporate tax evasion. I threw myself into it with more zeal than I'd ever felt before. My enthusiasm was artificial, but that wasn't the point. I needed the momentum to carry me through. On good days, I felt optimistic. Weary, as always, but triumphantly persistent. On bad days, I thought, "You bastards, you think this will make me hate him? It's you I'll resent, you I'll despise." On bad days, I made plans for global assurance. I hadn't been ready to fight them before, but when Chris was safe and my strength had returned, I'd find a way to hurt them. The reactions of my colleagues were mixed. Some were admiring. Some thought I'd let myself be exploited. Some were simply revolted by the thought of a human brain floating in my womb. And to challenge my own squeamishness, I confronted these people as often as I could. "Go on, touch it," I said. "It won't bite. It won't even kick." There was a brain in my womb, pale and convoluted. So what? I had an equally unappealing object in my own skull. In fact, my whole body was full of repulsing-looking offal, a fact which had never bothered me before. So I conquered my visceral reactions to the organ per se, but thinking about Chris himself remained a difficult balancing act. I resisted the insidious temptation to delude myself that I might be in touch with him, by telepathy, through the bloodstream, by any means at all. Maybe pregnant mothers had some genuine empathy with their unborn children. I'd never been pregnant. It wasn't for me to judge. Certainly, a child in the womb could hear its mother's voice. But a comatose brain, devoid of any sense organs, was a different matter entirely. At best, or worst, perhaps certain hormones in my blood crossed the placenta and had some limited effect on his condition. On his mood? He was in a coma. He had no mood. In fact, it was easiest and safest not to think of him as even being located inside me, let alone experiencing anything there. I was carrying a part of him. The surrogate mother of his clone was carrying another. Only when the two were united would he truly exist again. For now, he was in limbo, neither dead nor alive. This pragmatic approach worked, most of the time. Of course, there were moments when I suffered a kind of panic at the renewed realization of the bizarre nature of what I'd done. Sometimes I'd wake from nightmares believing, for a second or two, that Chris was dead and his spirit had possessed me, or that his brain had sent forth nerves into my body and taken control of my limbs, or that he was fully conscious and going insane from loneliness and sensory deprivation. But I wasn't possessed, my limbs still obeyed me, and every month a PET scan and a uterine EEG proved that he was still comatose. Undamaged, but mentally inert. In fact, the dreams I hated the most were those in which I was carrying a child. I'd wake from these with one hand on my belly, rapturously contemplating the miracle of the new life growing inside me, until I came to my senses and dragged myself angrily out of bed. I'd start the morning in the foulest of moods, grinding my teeth as I pissed, banging plates at the breakfast table, screaming insults at no one in particular while I dressed. Luckily, I was living alone. I couldn't really blame my poor besieged body for trying, though. My oversized marathon pregnancy dragged on and on. No wonder it tried to compensate me for the inconvenience with some stiff medicinal doses of maternal love. How ungrateful my rejection must have seemed, how baffling to find its images and sentiments rejected as inappropriate. So, I trampled on death, and I trampled on motherhood. Well, hallelujah! If sacrifices had to be made, what better victim could there have been than those two emotional slave drivers? And it was easy, really. Logic was on my side, with a vengeance. Chris was not dead. I had no reason to mourn him, whatever had become of the body I'd known. And the thing in my womb was not a child. Permitting a disembodied brain to be the object of motherly love would have been simply farcical. We think of our lives as circumscribed by cultural and biological taboos, but if people really want to break them, they always seem to find a way. Human beings are capable of anything: torture, genocide, cannibalism, rape. After which, or so I'd heard, most can still be kind to children and animals, be moved to tears by music, and generally behave as if all their emotional faculties are intact. So, what reason did I have to fear that my own minor and utterly selfless transgressions could do me any harm at all? I never met the new body's surrogate mother. I never saw the clone as a child. I did wonder, though, once I knew that the thing had been born, whether or not she'd found her normal pregnancy as distressing as I'd found mine. Which is easiest, I wondered, carrying a brain-damaged child-shaped object with no potential for human thought, grown from a stranger's DNA, or carrying the sleeping brain of your lover? Which is the hardest to keep from loving in inappropriate ways? At the start, I'd hoped to be able to blur all the details in my mind. I'd wanted to be able to wake one morning and pretend that Chris had merely been sick and was now recovered. Over the months, though, I'd come to realize that it was never going to work that way. When they took out the brain, I should have felt, at the very least, relieved, but I just felt numb and vaguely disbelieving. The ordeal had gone on for so long. It couldn't be over with so little fuss. No trauma, no ceremony. I'd had surreal dreams of laboriously but triumphantly giving birth to a healthy pink brain. But even if I'd wanted that, and no doubt the process could have been induced, the organ was too delicate to pass safely through the vagina. This cesarean removal was just one more blow to my biological expectations. A good thing, of course, in the long run, since my biological expectations could never be fulfilled, but I still couldn't help feeling slightly cheated. So I waited, in a daze, for the proof that it had all been worthwhile. The brain couldn't simply be transplanted into the clone, like a heart or a kidney. The peripheral nervous system of the new body wasn't identical to that of the old one. Identical genes weren't sufficient to ensure that. Also, despite drugs to limit the effect, parts of Chris's brain had atrophied slightly from disuse. So, rather than splicing nerves directly between the imperfectly matched brain and body, which probably would have left him paralyzed, deaf, dumb, and blind, the impulses would be routed through a computerized interface, which would try to sort out the discrepancies. Chris would still have to be rehabilitated, but the computer would speed up the process enormously, constantly striving to bridge the gap between thought and action, between reality and perception. The first time they let me see him, I didn't recognize him at all. His face was slack, his eyes unfocused. He looked like a large neurologically impaired child, which, of course, he was. I felt a mild twinge of revulsion. The man I'd seen after the train wreck, swarming with medical robots, had looked far more human, far more whole. I said, "Hello, it's me." He stared into space. The technician said, "It's early days." She was right. In the weeks that followed, his progress, or the computer's, was astounding. His posture and expression soon lost their disconcerting neutrality, and the first helpless twitches rapidly gave way to coordinated movement. Weak and clumsy, but encouraging. He couldn't talk, but he could meet my eyes. He could squeeze my hand. He was in there. He was back. There was no doubt about that. I worried about his silence, but I discovered later that he'd deliberately spared me his early faltering attempts at speech. One evening in the 5th week of his new life, when I came into the room and sat down beside the bed, he turned to me and said clearly, "They told me what you did. Oh God, Carla, I love you." His eyes filled with tears. I bent over and embraced him. It seemed like the right thing to do. And I cried, too. But even as I did so, I couldn't help thinking, none of this can really touch me. It's just one more trick of the body, and I'm immune to all that now. We made love on the third night he spent at home. I'd expected it to be a difficult, massive psychological hurdle for both of us, but that wasn't the case at all. After everything we'd come through, why should it have been? I don't know what I'd feared, some poor misguided avatar of the incest taboo crashing through the bedroom window at the critical moment, spurred on by the ghost of a discredited 19th century misogynist. I suffered no delusion at any level, from the merely subconscious right down to the endocrine, that Chris was my son. Whatever effects 2 years of placental hormones might have had on me, whatever behavioral programs they ought to have triggered, I'd apparently gained the strength and the insight to undermine completely. True, his skin was soft and unweathered, and devoid of the scars of a decade of hacking off facial hair. He might have passed for a 16-year-old, but I felt no qualms about that. Any middle-aged man who was rich enough and vain enough could have looked the same. And when he put his tongue to my breasts, I did not lactate. We soon started visiting friends. They were tactful, and Chris was glad of that, although personally I'd have happily discussed any aspect of the procedure. 6 months later, he was working again. His old job had been taken, but a new firm was recruiting, and they wanted a youthful image. Piece by piece, our lives were reassembled. Nobody, looking at us now, would think that anything had changed. But they'd be wrong. To love a brain as if it were a child would be ludicrous. Geese might be stupid enough to treat the first animal they see upon hatching as their mother, but there are limits to what a sane human being will swallow. So, reason triumphed over instinct, and I conquered my inappropriate love. Under the circumstances, there was never really any contest. Having deconstructed one form of enslavement, though, I find it all too easy to repeat the process, to recognize the very same chains in another guise. Everything special I once felt for Chris is transparent to me now. I still feel genuine friendship for him. I still feel desire, but there used to be something more. If there hadn't been, I doubt he'd be alive today. Oh, the signals keep coming through. Some part of my brain still pumps out cues for appropriate feelings of tenderness, but these messages are as laughable and as ineffectual now as the contrivances of some 10th-rate tear-jerking movie. I just can't suspend my disbelief anymore. I have no trouble going through the motions. Inertia makes it easy. And as long as things are working, as long as his company is pleasant and the sex is good, I see no reason to rock the boat. We may stay together for years, or I may walk out tomorrow. I really don't know. Of course, I'm still glad that he survived, and to some degree I can even admire the courage and selflessness of the woman who saved him. I know that I could never do the same. Sometimes, when we're together, and I see in his eyes the very same helpless passion that I've lost, I'm tempted to pity myself. I think, I was brutalized. No wonder I'm a cripple. No wonder I'm so fucked up. And in a sense, that's a perfectly valid point of view. But I never seem to be able to subscribe to it for long. The new truth has its own cool passion, its own powers of manipulation. It assails me with words like freedom and insight, and speaks of the end of all deception. It grows inside me day by day, and it's far too strong to let me have regrets. And that was Appropriate Love by Greg Egan. Like I said, kind of depressing. Woman saves husband through life-saving procedure by having his brain inserted into her womb and carried there for 2 years while a clone body is grown. But it ultimately destroys her passion in her relationship with him because, largely due to the crassness of the system, as it were, the insurance companies, and the fact that she was forced to do this, uh, effectively forced to do it. I mean, okay, yes, technically she could have let him die, but it's her husband. You know, people generally aren't too keen on doing that, in my experience. I know I wouldn't. Just letting them die. Dark stuff, very introspective stuff. It makes you, what would you do in their situation? You know, I don't know what I'd do. I don't. I really don't. Crazy, but good stuff. Well, thanks for tuning in. If anyone tuned in, if you're watching slash listening to this after the fact, great. Feel free to shoot me a line or something if you liked it. If you didn't like it, shoot me a line anyway. Always want feedback of any kind. And I guess that'll call it for me for today. Next week I'll definitely marathon through the rest of it because again we're like 1, 2, 3 stories away. One of which has the return of the Ndoli device slash Jewel in a really a similarly depressing incarnation, actually, to the story you just heard, in that it is used for relationship purposes, and things don't turn out quite as they'd expect. Um, Also, kind of dealing with the nature of perspective. That one's pretty good, though. I like all the stories in this, even the ones that are like really depressing are still very good stories because it's like, oh yeah, what if, you know? What if? All right, and with that, guys and girls and children of all ages, if your parents are letting you listen to this stuff, uh, thanks for tuning in and have a great day. See you all next week. I, as always, have my Mecha Mondays stream and my Warframe Wednesdays stream as well. And yeah, see. Well, I won't see, but I guess you will. And you won't see me. You'll see what I'm doing. Whatever. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. Have a good one. Hope you enjoyed.